Welcome to another episode of the Unredacted podcast. My name is Nikita and welcome. So, guys, we have spoken a fair amount about drugs in India. We spoke about the history of opium, the enriched history of hashish. We spoke about what the cultural perception of cannabis is in India and generally what led to the enactment of the NDPS Act. I think it's a fit time now to kind of dive into the NDPS Act and speak a little bit about what its provisions are, why it's considered to be one of the most heinous acts in our country right now, and whether we need a cultural shift in our minds when we look at drug addicts and drug abuse in general. We spoke to Ms. Neha Singhal, who is a senior resident fellow at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. And her area of research is the criminalization of drugs. She is, in fact, the co author of this report called From Addict to Convict, which looks at drug abuse in Punjab. And it's a brilliant piece of work, and I can go as far to say that nobody has done such a deep dive into the NDPS Act in our country and given us such a holistic picture of where we're at with this act. So, the first page of this report, which is titled From Addict to Convict, the first page of this report has a quote by Billie Holiday, which makes a parallel between drug addicts and diabetics. Say that would you penalize a diabetic person for taking insulin? So why do you do what you do to drug addicts? This is definitely a very interesting perspective and one that we have not heard a lot before. So let's see what Neha has to say
I
about.
think there's a lot of stigma and judgment around addicts and addiction, and people generally who haven't dealt with drugs or consumed drugs themselves think of addiction as a choice that one could just leave, or somebody could be scolded or punished out of it. But addiction is a very it grips your body, takes hold of the person, and it's impossible for the person to let go of addiction unless they're actually treated and helped. And sending them to jails is not going to help them, it is not going to treat them, it is only criminalizing them and stigmatizing them as criminals. But what they actually are people who are, they're extremely sick people who need medical intervention. So I think the state in or the governments wherever addiction or the drug use has been criminalized have this strange idea that if you just scolded them hard enough or punished them hard enough, people would stop. But that's no sickness works like that, and addiction is no exception to
Said
that.
about the NDPS Act being an extremely heinous act with a lot of strict provisions. And this is often the foundation of this is, of course, a very paternalistic attitude of the state, to be the vanguard for its citizens, to say that its citizens can't indulge in things that may harm them. But what are some of these very strict provisions, and what do they intend to do to people who are either caught as drug consumers of the drug or caught as peddlers of the drug?
So normally, in layman's terms, we assume innocence until proven guilty.
Right.
In the NDPS Act, wherever there is a culpable state of mind, wherever you need to have a state of mind to commit any act, the law presumes that you had it. If it also basically wherever mental element has to be presumed, it presumes it, and it is for the person to now prove that he did not know that he possessed the drug, for example, or
Yeah.
that he did not know that there were drugs being cultivated in a property owned by him. So wherever it is now upon the accused to prove that he did not know, and that's what this law does. And it is so insidious, this law, because this provision of reversal of burden of proof has been incorporated in so many laws today, and it's become a mainstay of the Indian criminal justice system. Most of your special acts now will have a clause for reversal of burden of proof. So
Right.
wherever we think that a strict crime or like a serious crime is happening, whether it is sexual offenses against children, they'll keep reversing burden of proof, and this trend was definitely started by the NDPS Act.
Been said about the strict liability provisions within the NDPS Act. What would happen to somebody, let's say, if they are caught with a small amount of cannabis or a small amount of any other drug? What would happen to them under the NDPS
Either
Act?
be charged with possession for small quantity of drugs, or you could be charged with under section 27, which is for consumption of narcotic or psychotropic substances. So it depends on the police and what they're charging at that time. But most likely, you'll be charged under Section 27 for being a consumer of drugs. So basically, strict liability, as it occurs in the NDPS Act, is that it makes possession sufficient to charge and convict. So if you have been found with 50 grams of weed, 50 grams, whatever, 100 grams of heroin, whatever it may be, why you have it? Are you a user? Are you a peddler? Are you a trafficker? This is irrelevant. The punishment is only given on the basis of the quantity that you possess. And this act has a very interesting way of doing this, because it has three categories of possessions: small quantity, intermediate quantity, and commercial quantity.
Right.
The act itself only gets into small and commercial, and it says that when you have small quantity, you're presumed to be a user. When you have commercial quantity in your possession, you're presumed to be a trafficker.
Yeah.
But it then also has a negatively defined category of intermediate quantity, which we colloquially call intermediate quantity. Is there is no definition, there is no understanding of what this intermediate category means. Are they users? Are they traffickers? Are they peddlers? What are they? And this is a massive category. Like for heroin, I keep giving this example. It's 5 grams to 250 grams. What ends up happening on the ground is that the people who are getting arrested are the in-between people. They're not traffickers. They're not people who are carrying commercial quantities. Rarely will you find any cases with commercial quantities. It's
Right.
usually intermediate category. And the intermediate category don't get the benefit of being an addict. And well, they're not traffickers. So what are they? And that's something very particular about this
On
law.
what basis does sentencing and punishment happen under this law?
If you're caught with small quantities of any drug, you can be punished with imprisonment for up to a year, intermediate quantity up to 10 years, and commercial quantity 10 years and above. Mandatory minimum is 10 years. So that's the least that you will get. So and these classifications can be a little absurd sometimes, because something like, say, marijuana has a small quantity marker of 1 kg. So if you're caught with anything less than a kg, you are considered to be a user, which is a crazy amount for it to be a small quantity. For some other drugs like buprenorphine, it's like 2 milligrams. So it's a ridiculously small amount, and because something like buprenorphine is found in an injection form or in a soluble form, people will always, even if you're caught with a single injection, you would have crossed the small quantity mark because of all the solubles, etc., in it. But that's what the law does. It says that when the amount of the quantity is being gauged, it has to be the entire quantity and not just the pure substance. So
Right.
if you're carrying 100 grams of powder and you have only 2 grams of cocaine in it, you will still be charged and convicted for 100 grams.
Your report, which is titled From Addict to Convict, what were your key findings within Punjab, and why is it called, why is it one of the most severely affected places with drugs in India?
So in Punjab itself, I did notice that all narcotic drugs. So the bigger problem there, or the bigger use there, is not marijuana; it's poppy husk. It's opium based, because that's what the state traditionally uses. That opium-based punishment, poppy husk-based drugs received a much lesser punishment than, say, your psychotropic substances, or drugs that were the medical drugs. Like Punjab has a big problem with cough syrups and things like that. So those
Pharmaceutical drugs, basically.
pharmaceutical drugs, yes.
Yeah.
So all the pharmaceutical combinations. So those got a much higher punishment than your narcotic drugs. But in the law itself, there is no distinction. And like, say, something like Punjab, drugs are, I don't even know whether this should be said out, but drugs are easily accessible within prisons. How can they not be? Imagine if a person is heavily addicted, the police has to provide him with drugs, because either you give them proper de-addiction treatment, or these people will drive everybody around them crazy. I have seen a person banging their head repeatedly against the head because they were going against the wall, because they were going through such acute withdrawal symptoms. So now, if there is somebody who's banging their head against the jail bars, the police will get them drugs.
Yeah.
So, and even within the NDPS Act, Section 71 allows for rehabilitation, right? It allows for opioid substitution therapy, because the law itself recognizes that sometimes you need substitution to be able to be weaned off drugs. If the law itself recognizes that this is needed for somebody who's an addict, then to also subject the same person to jail is absurd. It makes no sense. Your police is acutely understaffed. Jail staff is acutely understaffed. These people are also handling death row inmates, rapists, addicts. Think of a crime, and it's these two bodies are handling them: your correctional institutions and your police. So to expect these people to also now be sensitized towards addicts' needs is an impossible ask. So there, one could try, and sometimes just being human beings and seeing the suffering of another person, they do get sensitized. They're not always. In fact, I think that the police and jail staff are a lot more sensitive to addicts than a lot of your middle class society is, because they're seeing the suffering firsthand, but they're not given training as such.
You, it's very clear that there are two different and diverging paths which we can take to deal with the supposed problems of drugs in our country and to deal with drug addicts. And both of these paths actually depend on public perception and how the public perceives drug addicts, right? The first is, of course, to let the criminal justice system take its course, to incarcerate drug addicts on the daily, where they're languishing in prison for years and basically losing their only shot at redemption and reintegration back into civil society, and not really dealing with the problem of consumption of drugs itself. Right. And this, of course, path firmly believes in the fact that deterrence is something that can be achieved, and that if X is languishing in jail for so many years, Y will automatically not do drugs. This is, of course, the path that we are standing on right now as a country. While the second path is that you let the healthcare facilities take charge and intervene, and whenever a drug addict is found by the state machinery, they're actually redirected to de-addiction centers and rehabilitation centers and actually cure the problem that is caused by the consumption of drugs and the problem of addiction itself. And but the second path then means that all of drug consumption needs to be decriminalized, and essentially all the criminal provisions need to be let go. So do you think that that is a natural next step, and that is something that we should now be looking towards?
Think so. I think all criminal provisions regarding addiction should be removed. Absolutely. I think that any drug, regardless of whether it is heroin or cannabis or anything, that if use of any kind should be decriminalized, not just addiction. Because if a person is a recreational user, it's even crazier. They are useful members of society. They go to work, they come back from work, they light a joint, they smoke. I don't know, whatever it is they do, they're not harming anybody. So sending these people to jails is absurd, and sending an addict who actually needs medical treatment to jail is also absurd. So any kind of drug use should be decriminalized, in my opinion. Problematic drug use should get into the health system, and non-problematic drug use should be left alone. If a person is a recreational coke user, they go to parties and they party all night and then go come and sleep on a Sunday. How is it harming anybody? As in, let them use coke. How does it matter? So that's your non-problematic user. Somebody whose life is actively getting affected by their drug use, they should be sent into the health system. So yes, that's the but the law needn't concern itself with either, is what I'm saying. At least criminal law needn't concern itself with either.
Clearly, incarcerating drug addicts is not the right way to go. But what are the arrest numbers in India like right now under the NDPS Act?
NDPS makes arrests very easy. For example, in Bombay, 2016, 17 onwards, I think the Maharashtra saw a huge shift, like a huge jump in NDPS arrests.
Right.
It from Punjab being number one in NDPS arrests in the country, it moved to Punjab, it moved to Maharashtra overnight. One
Yeah.
year, suddenly from like 5,000 arrests, it went to 15 or 20,000 arrests, and all of these arrests were coming out of Bombay, all. So 95% of those arrests were from Bombay. And then I realized, because that's strange, right? There is no reason for this to happen overnight. And one would assume Bollywood, commercial capital, etc. But what was happening was that the Bombay police had been pressurized to increase their arrest rates and get sure shot convictions to look like they were hard on crime. Because when you only look at numbers, you don't look at numbers under the act and within the act under the section, right? When you're boasting about how your police is doing well, you
Yeah.
only boast about the number of arrests and
Yeah.
convictions. Acts like the NDPS Act make it very convenient to arrest and convict. So what they started doing in Bombay is only arresting people for consumption and not possession. right? So only under
Right.
Section 27. So, and then what they would make them do is plead guilty on the spot when they're being presented before the magistrate, get a conviction on the spot. So, like the whole process of arrest to conviction took about half a day. So, this was very, very easy for them to do. And that's what NDPS does. Laws like NDPS do. So, they're not incentivized to go after addicts per se. They're just, police is incentivized to increase the arrest numbers. So, they will always find the easiest laws to do it under. Also, what happens under the NDPS Act is that because bail is so hard to get, right? As a bail under your normal criminal procedure is a matter of right, but NDPS Act makes it very hard to get bail. You have to hear the prosecutor, the judge has to believe prima facie that the person is probably not guilty. All the things that come at a much later stage are now required to be done at the bail stage under the NDPS Act. That prevented that. So not just NDPS. I noticed that I think 2018 or 19 onwards, PIT NDPS, which is the Preventive Detention Wing of the NDPS Act, was seeing detentions of about 70 to 75,000 people per year. That's
Yeah.
crazy. That's a crazy number of people that you're arresting, like hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of people under the NDPS Act as is. Plus, you're also now detaining 70,000 people plus every year under the PIT
Right.
NDPS Act.
Right.
So this is, if you have a legislation like that, which makes it hard for the person to get out, the police is going to use it, abuse it, whatever it may be.
Definitely, there is also a very obvious bias in the NDPS, right? Because it is a very common thing that the most visible are often the most marginalized who are then picked up, right? Like, even if we spoke about the right to privacy in this situation, most people who are privileged and have the resources, they can partake in these habits, within the four corners of their home, away from the public eye, and then, of course, take the minimal risk and continue to do what they're doing. But drug addicts are routinely picked up off the streets and, routinely put in jail. So, do you think there's a very obvious class bias with the NDPS? And are there steps being taken to kind of look the other way and also see other people who are doing this?
Law doesn't have a class bias. The law is just the law. The implementation of the law has a class bias because, like you said, the most visible, the easiest to catch are the ones that are going to be caught. Um, what the police does nothing to try to find the links behind the people they have caught. They do nothing at all, and they won't because the law doesn't require them to. If the law only says that possession is sufficient, they're not going to go behind the intent or try to figure out where they got the source, where they sourced this 1 kg of heroin from. As in, if they have a kg, there's probably 100 kgs around.
Yeah.
So they know and the law doesn't require them to. So why would the police bother? Because the police is only interested in its arrest
I
numbers. If it
definitely
gets
want to ask you, how do you envision the NDPS and where should we be with our drug laws?
my ideal NDPS Act would be that it didn't exist. I would expect, or I would want the world to be a prohibition-free world
Free world.
because prohibition only drives crime. It drives consumption of substances underground, which creates further demand of more devious forms of drugs. What the NDPS Act does, it also criminalizes controlled substances. It criminalizes psychotropic and narcotic substances. So you can only charge under the NDPS Act if the substance in its exact combination is mentioned in the schedule. So what your manufacturers, peddlers, traffickers, what they do is just change the composition of the drug slightly so that
Right.
it no longer comes under the NDPS Act, and then that gets consumed, and that becomes a new drug in the market. In 2015, in Bombay especially, there was this drug called Meow Meow, which became really popular. It was apparently synthetic heroin, and it wasn't covered under the NDPS Act because the components of it weren't under the NDPS Act. And then the police had to try for about a year before it was added to the schedule, and of course, then they could go after these people in under the NDPS Act. And this is a constant battle where there are more and more substances, more and more controlled substances which are being played around with, and people are using them for consumption. And then it's like this race against time for the police to then include them within the NDPS Act.